What's up, everybody? How you doing, guys? Today I have another exciting live stream for our November promotion, and I'm going to be talking about SAT mistakes that people are still making that they shouldn't. So let me share my screen here, and we'll just get into it. Let me just get set up. All right. So we're all set up and ready to go. So once again, guys, today we're going to be talking about SAT mistakes that people make that they're still making that can be avoided, right? We're going to go over some basic things. A lot of these things are easy fixes and ways to get more points on the SAT. So definitely lock in with me here and let's get into it, right? So we're going to go over a few different things here, right? Common reading mistakes, common issues for grammar questions, writing and language mistakes, math mistakes, and then general test taking mistakes. We're also going to go over at the end some ways that we can fix these things. So let's get right into it. So, common reading mistakes. The biggest common mistake I see for students on reading passages is that they just don't read for context, right? They read solely for content and they don't try to read between the lines and understand the context of what they're reading. So, a lot of times when students do this, they kind of miss the point of a passage. They don't see the deeper meaning, and that affects their score. Another big, very simple mistake that students make is they just miss things like not, accept, negative questions, questions that are phrased in the reverse of how they normally would be phrased or how a student assumes that the question is phrased. And that oftentimes leads to students thinking that they got a question right, but in fact, they actually got it wrong because they put the opposite answer. Of course, on a not question or an accept question, they're going to put the opposite answers as answer choices, leading students to believe that they're right when they're not. Another common mistake people make on reading type questions is spending way too much time on one question. If you don't have the answer to the question in, a few minutes, you definitely want to just move on from that question, prioritize your time on other things and make sure that you're moving through the test effectively. So many students waste way too much time on the things they don't know instead of focusing on things that they do know or that they can figure out. So try to avoid that one if possible. Let's go over a common mistake here, right? You have this passage, and then it says, which of the following is not mentioned as a consequence of deforestation? A lot of students miss these kinds of not questions, right? This can happen in a lot of different contexts. This is just an example, right? You want to make sure that you pay attention to the prompts, right? That you make sure that you're not missing something where there's a not, a negative, or some opposite that's depicted in the answer, right? So without rereading, right? You're probably going to miss that. So you always want to make sure to reread things, reread passages, and make sure that you're getting things sorted. Let's talk about some common writing and language mistakes. So mistakes that students make on grammar questions, right? Um, Obviously, focusing on grammar rules is a good thing, but sometimes you can miss the intended meaning, right? So if you're just focused on rules or you're just focused on meaning, that's not going to be the most effective way to do it. You want to make sure to focus on both. Additionally, you want to make sure to pay attention to the tone, right? Sometimes there's grammatically correct answers that are just wrong. The vocabulary used is incorrect or something like that. And then also people sometimes confuse words that sound similar to other words they know, and then they do this on purpose on tests like the SAT, right? They put a word that is one letter off of a word that you know to make you think, well, it probably means something similar. It usually means something very different, right? So as a good check, you always want to read the sentences out loud in your head. Do they sound natural? Sometimes that doesn't exactly work because there are times where the correct answer is very awkward sounding. So you have to be aware that both are going to come into play on something like the SAT. All right. And here's an example of a grammar question, right? You want to make sure to pay attention to the tone. You want to make sure to pay attention to punctuation, right? You could see here, they very subtly change punctuation marks on these questions, right? So you could see in here, you have comma, semicolon, semicolon, comma. So you want to make sure to pay attention to all those things. Students miss stuff like that because it's just tucked in here very subtly, and you could easily miss that and therefore get the question wrong. Let's talk about some common math mistakes, right? One of the biggest mistake on math, most likely, is misreading questions, right? You take a lot of time to solve for X, but then the answer the test wants is 2X, right? So you put down 5, the correct answer is choice B, which was 10. You did all this work, you solved for X, you did it effectively, but then you just mistakenly put X instead of 2X, and then you get it wrong. You won't even realize that you got that question wrong, and this is the instance where students think they're doing well on the SAT, but then their score comes out much lower. That usually means they're missing certain subtle things and problems that have them falling into tricks and traps. Right. Another big mistake people make is skipping certain steps in problems. A lot of the SAT math questions are extremely long-winded, multi-step problems. If you skip a step or you make some sort of mistake with one of the steps, the answer is going to come out wrong. So you want to be aware that this is a step-by-step process. You put one foot in front of the other when you're doing SAT math problems, and you make sure that you're not making errors. Um, a lot of times people choose the wrong path, right? So on a lot of these algebraic problems, you can solve algebraically. You can also plug in numbers, which may be faster. A seasoned test taker will know which one to do when, right? So sometimes you have to solve algebraically. Sometimes plugging in is faster and more effective, and you want to make sure to do that. So you don't want to waste time. It's hard to know which one is right. That takes experience, practice, and time. Um, Additionally, if you are using a plugging in strategy or some sort of grind way to get an answer, you want to make sure to double check your calculations to avoid mistakes. A lot of times students use those strategies effectively, but then somehow execute it improperly and get the wrong answer. And that's very frustrating. When you use strategies, you want to make sure it's to your benefit. So let's talk about this kind of math problem. You could see there's a lot of units, right? A length of 12 centimeters, width of 5 centimeters. And now we're talking about meters. So they're changing from meters to centimeters, and you want to make sure that you're reading the units properly. You want to make sure that you don't skip steps, and you want to make sure that you try to solve algebraically if that is the best path, which on this kind of question it is. So why don't you see if you guys can do this question? This is an important kind of question for something like the SAT because it highlights a lot of the common mistakes that students tend to make. Let's talk about some general test taking mistakes that students make on something like the SAT. Not pacing yourself and putting yourself under time pressure. One of the biggest mistakes that students make. If you are running out of time in the last few questions on the SAT math, it's going to be pretty hard to get to that harder module too, right? You end up second guessing yourself, leaving points on the table. That's a huge mistake, right? Like, especially on English, I've found over the years that students' natural inclination, their first right answer is usually much more likely to be correct than rethinking it and redoing it and coming back again, right? So obviously, sometimes you have to do that, and this is where test taking experience, knowing when do I need to redo something, when do I need to go back, when do I need to go over it again, is hugely important, right? Students also ignore strategies sometimes. As many times as they try to use them, they sometimes forget, right? So skipping techniques like plugging in answers or back solving, forgetting to use Desmos, not practicing under time conditions and getting into time trouble. These are all mistakes that students make on standardized tests that are easily avoidable. Write down a list of your strategies. Make sure you know how to use them, when to use them, and you will do better on something like the SAT without a doubt, right? This is how you do better. These tests are gameable. They are approachable if you know how to go about it, right? If you're treating it like a school exam, you're only going to make mistakes. Hello, Javo. What up, Javo? Hello, hello. Thanks for joining. Throw a hi in the chat for Javo. Shout out to Javo. You always want to practice under time conditions. Make sure that you're timing yourself. You're doing your diagnostic exams. And if you need to use Blue Book, obviously you can use that. There's other software that you can use, but that's one of the big mistakes that people make, right? They just don't time themselves and they get into time trouble. How can we fix these things, right? So what's the best way to fix these errors if I am making a mistake, right? Create a mistake log, right? use a spreadsheet, Google Doc, or a piece of paper, right? Write down errors that you make on practice tests. Write down errors that you make on certain types of questions and fix them, right? If you go through your performance and you write down 2 or 3 errors every time you do a test and you fix those 2 or 3 errors, your score is going to go up, right? So that's a hugely important tip. Students that make mistakes logs tend to do really well on these kind of exams. Any student that I've had that has done something like that has improved their score a lot just from really focusing on their mistakes and being honest with themselves about what kind of mistakes they make. You also want to make sure to focus on your weak areas. So if you do have a weaker area on something like the SAT, you want to put time and energy into that. But at the same time, you don't want to ignore easy points, right? A lot of students look at only the things I'm really bad at X, Y, and Z. I'm going to spend all my time studying those things. That's good, right? You should do that, but you also want to pay attention to where you can get easy points. I'm already pretty good at grammar. Let me perfect that portion of the test. I'm already pretty solid in math. Let me perfect some of my math skills, remember some of my grammar rules, math formulas, and get a higher score. So you want to look for the low hanging fruit on these kind of tests. What's the easiest way I can improve my score, right? It's great to work on the things that you really truly struggle with, but at the same time, you want to optimize the things you're good at, right? So if you take a practice SAT and you get a 650 on English and a 450 on math, obviously you need to put some time into the math, but you should try to get your English over 700 to buoy your score, to bring it up to a really nice level, get that hammered out, and then you don't have to worry about that as much, right? You also need to learn the mindset of the SAT, right? Understand how the test works. It's predictable. It's very consistent, test over test. The same things will be tested, the same things will be focused on, right? So you want to make sure to focus on those things. Learn what the most prevalent things on the exam are, write them down in your mistake log, make sure you know them, and then your score is going to go up very quickly, right? Because you're hammering out things that are the most important things to know on this kind of test. And that's exactly what you need to do. So hopefully these tips were helpful. Thank you guys for joining on to this live stream. I'm going to be doing these periodically just to give out some quick tips for you guys. So once again, thanks for joining. Keep studying, keep pushing, and never give up.